Thanks for joining us for our annual conversation with a leader in our justice system, and in this instance, the regulatory and integrity space in particular. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country wherever you may be joining us today. We are talking on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay respects to their elders and to all the generations of Wurundjeri and other First Nations peoples. At the VLF, we recognise the impact of colonisation, its legacy of injustice, and the marginalisation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and we believe that acknowledging the past is an essential step in building a better and more equitable future. Victoria Law Foundation aims to break down the barriers to justice for all Victorians. We are genuinely committed to making a contribution to a better justice system for all of us, but especially for those vulnerable and in most need. We've been in the so-called information age for decades now, but the mind-blowing and accelerating advances over the last decade or so have taken this to a whole new level of both promise but also potential disruption. But when you think about how much information government holds on all of us through all the services it provides and the processes that we participate in through hospitals and schools and the electoral process and transport and local government, property ownership, police, all of it, there's a huge amount that government holds. So who has access to all that data, for what purpose, and in what form are really critical questions that go to our rights to privacy, but also to the integrity of government and to its functionality. There is both state and federal legislation which cover these issues, and in Victoria the key pieces of legislation are the Privacy and Data Protection Act and the Freedom of Information Act, which fall under the watchful eye of the Victorian Information Commissioner. Sean Morrison took up that role in February this year after an extensive and diverse career in the law, working as a general counsel in state government departments and then as a special investigator, which I think makes him sound a bit like Elliot Ness. Sean also led the government responses to 3 state and federal royal commissions on mental health, people with a disability and aged care. And he's also been deeply involved in legislative reform, including the Victorian laws on voluntary assisted dying, prevention of family violence, and information sharing in public health. So, this CV pulls together investigation, recommendation and reform, which puts him in a particularly strong position to take on what seems to me to be the massive challenge that is overseeing the management of the vast amounts of information that the state holds. So we thought we'd find out a bit more. Sean, good to meet you and thanks for having us.
Thanks, Lynn, and thanks for the big up there. That sounds more impressive than I am, but I appreciate your research. I
think as we proceed through this conversation, it won't be more impressive than you actually are. But let's go back to day minus 20, when you did your job interview. When you were asked why you wanted this gig, Sean, given that it was relatively recently, how did you answer?
I just reflected on the importance of the role at first and that this is a critical time and that I thought I had the skills to steward the office through these important times. So really it was about indicating how I could make a difference and also how I would, what my vision for the future of OVIC was.
I'm going to get to the vision in a bit, but let's go back to pre-OVIC days.
Yes.
What, in all the roles that you've held to date, do you think have been the most useful to you in taking up this role? Are there elements of those previous undertakings that have put you in good stead now?
Definitely. I think I've always worked in resource-constrained environments. Just
you mean tight budgets, no money?
that's your words, but I'll say resource constrained, and where you've had to deliver on important projects in a short timeline. But I think the thing that's held me in good stead is I've been lucky to work with some brilliant people, and I know people always say that, but genuinely I could go through government now and point out the lawyers that have really made a difference. They really hide their skills. They're not self-promoters, and I've been lucky to work with those people and effectively copy and mimic and take all of the best parts that they do, and led me to here today. So that's things like legal judgment, risk assessment, communicating with people, good people management, understanding where the job ends and where your life should start. So all of those critical skills.
It's interesting. So the well-being dimension
yes, definitely.
is something you've
definitely
seen in others?
Yes, and it's something where I think lawyers forget that there is a well-being element, and that if you want a long career in the law, you have to be mindful of your well-being. It's easy to say yes, but if you've got a good relationship with someone, you can always knock back work in a polite way. So it's all about relationships, basically.
Totally, always is. Let's talk a bit about OVIC, which is the Office of the Victorian Information Commissioner. You are the Vic in OVIC.
Yes.
What happens in your office day to day? What goes on here?
Well, if I start with really our mission. Our mission is to promote and uphold information rights in Victoria. So not just for Victorians, but anyone interacting with public sector agencies. So that's our broad mission. But what happens in the office from day to day is usually, we come in the morning, and after I've made my porridge.
You make porridge in the office?
Usually about lunchtime, but anyway, it's breakfast, lunch. We won't we'll get into that. But in the office, generally, it's a hive of activity. It's a small office, so there's always things going on. If you think about the three-man trenches of work we do around information security, privacy and freedom of information, there's always a review that's critical that needs to be done. There's always a privacy breach that we're dealing with, and there's always an investigation that's on foot. So there's never a day where nothing's happening, there's not a due date, there's not something critical that needs to be done. So with a small team and a large remit, there's a lot of pressure on. Every day there's a critical decision.
So let's talk a little bit more about the powers that you have. How wide is your reach, for a start? So government,
yes.
Broadly put, but does that extend to things like agencies or organisations that work to governments? Would it extend that far?
It does. If you think about the public sector, it's not just government departments, it's universities, hospitals, TAFEs, local councils. But if you get down into the weeds, depending on the powers, sometimes they're in, sometimes they're out. For example, information security, generally health services are out, and universities are out, but privacy they're in. So it's a bit of a mosaic, but in general, we do cover the public sector. You think about it, it's a government agency, and we also cover contract service providers.
Yes.
So if they're performing a function on behalf of government, we have some oversight of that function, but we can't reach right in.
That's another dimension of your decision-making, really, about whether or not you've got scope or remit to look at this particular issue.
Sometimes there are jurisdictional issues,
yes.
and the reform we're pushing for in all of these areas would really cut into those jurisdictional issues, because we're seeing now that government is getting the private sector to do more for it, or there might be better value, and we think that there needs to be better reach.
So let's talk about the powers too. Can you compel people to respond to you?
Yes, we can. We can compel people. Because we're part of the integrity framework, you can think that we have similar powers to other integrity bodies. So we can compel people to appear, provide a statement. There's the similar powers. People are required to assist us. We have investigative powers. We can do audits, examinations, investigations, issue compliance notices. So we are very much like a regulator, except in the world of privacy and information access, it's not quite as sexy as other regulators. We're not kicking in doors or anything like that. We prefer to co-regulate, but we do have all of those powers.
So when it comes to enforcement, what capacity do you have to make sure people actually respond to your requests?
We do deal with the standard enforcement triangle, which is education and co-regulation at the bottom. At the very top of that triangle is the actual enforcement. So we try with education first and stewarding people through what the correct process is. So we come from not the principle of we can't investigate every issue, it's more about is it significant harm? And then once we get involved in enforcement, we'll issue reports. So if you go to OVIC's website, you'll see some of the reports we've issued and some of the poor behaviour or what we would call learning opportunities for other organisations.
You mentioned the integrity framework in Victoria, and that's the Ombudsman, the Victorian Inspectorate and IBAC,
yes.
and you.
Yes.
So that network, do you work together? How does that come together?
We try to work together, noting that they're different oversight functions, but we are, part of my appointment is I want to work better with those regulators, but noting that the Victorian Inspectorate oversees OVIC and its powers, that's slightly difficult because they need some independence. But we've reached out to those organisations and we're trying to get some community of practice happening.
And what benefit do you think that offers Victorians, that there are these 4 agencies that are in similar sorts of regulatory or quasi-regulatory spaces with significant powers and reach? Is that a protective shield, if you like, that's fit for purpose?
If it works, it is. And I think what it does, it comes down to the principles of trust in government, and it can't just be blind trust. There needs to be some kind of oversight of these functions to ensure that they're occurring properly, and it's just part of good governance. We always say who will watch the watchers, and there's someone overseeing OVIC, and we also have oversight by the Integrity and Oversight Committee of Parliament. So it's not as if we can exercise our powers blindly and without concern for, due fair procedure and proper process. So I think it's important for citizens. It's a mechanism to give trust in government and increase that social licence.
Well, I want to talk about that with regard to 2 big bits of legislation that you are deeply involved with. So the Freedom of Information Act, which is, I think, a really valuable effort to increase transparency and to open up government decision making. And then we have I would say privacy, but most people say privacy,
yes,
and Data Protection Act, which is really about the sort of apparatus and the application of privacy protections in the state. And if you were to think about these coming together, it feels like they're in tension. One is about opening up government and allowing access to information, and the other is about protecting it. So in your mind, how do they work together? Is that a useful combination, or does it feel sometimes like you're kind of giving with one hand and taking with the other?
No, I think they all work together, and they work together well. They're part of what is sort of an umbrella of information management. And if I think about an example where if you provide information to a government organisation, you have a right under privacy laws to know what information a government holds about you. So freedom of information provides that right of you knowing what's there. And for a freedom of information request to work properly, that organisation needs to know if the information it holds about you is accurate, it's required to under privacy laws, and also where that information is, and that's required under privacy laws. So privacy laws help you get access, and information security makes sure that your information is protected. So citizens sometimes don't have a choice about giving government information if they want their services. So all of these 3 make sure that it's treated fairly and in accordance with how it's collected, it's treated securely, and that you can access that information about you, the rights to know and what's happening with it. And so FOI has a broader reach, but you can see where your information goes, what policy it goes into, request government information about that. So they all, I think, work quite well
together. FOI is, I think, a beautiful example of that moment in the 80s when there was a sort of an expansion, I think, of commitment to citizens' rights.
Yes.
And it was founded on this very sound principle of transparency of government and access to information that was, your information that others held. But there is this persistent, and I have to say fairly strong concern, that FOI has kind of lost its momentum, that there are ways and means of slow walking this stuff or frustrating applications, and that it's losing its purpose. What do you make of those sorts of comments?
It's definitely time for reform. So, like a lot of things in the 80s, it's time to put them to bed. They, it's not back in fashion, but I would say that FOI definitely needs reform, and the Act has served its purpose. So really our line is the Act's not fit for purpose. My predecessor and the other commissioners did a fantastic job in eking out and squeezing out all of the lemon from the last Act and proactive release, what can be done, making sure that people are operating in the spirit of the Act. But it really needs legislative change to go to the next stage. It's basically past its use-by date.
So what needs to happen?
Well, I think that there needs to be a legislative, proactive and mandatory release scheme so that certain types of information are automatically released as required by law, and better protections. Some agencies want to proactively release information, but they can't because they don't get the protections that the Act provides for an official request. Then there's other things around, do we have a mandatory cabinet register that's released like in other jurisdictions? So it's moving it from what is now, it's a pull mechanism, you have to make a request to pull that information out, to a push. And we've seen where there's been a shift in this sort of ideology in other states, the amount of requests have gone down because...
They don't have to.
No. The information is out there, there's a register of this information, so if someone's looking for something, it's online. The other thing is agencies are creaking under the weight of the cottage industry that is now FOI.
Yeah.
It's expensive to administer, it's quite technical. We know agency resources are precious, so it would actually benefit agencies as well as the public.
If they didn't have to deal with requests and respond to them, and it was just a mandatory release.
That's right.
So, as it currently stands though, OVIC's role with FOI is what, dealing with complaints if people haven't been able to access information, or what's your gig?
It's a dual function. One is complaints, so we have the professional standards that have been around since 2019, and we're about to issue some new professional standards. So they're requirements of how people must administer the Act and some guidance for agencies. So we get a lot of complaints about those, and you can imagine they're increasing year on year. And so we look at adherence to the standards and also review decisions where there's been a denial of access to information.
So mandatory release would benefit your office too?
Yes, it would. But the reform isn't about making life easy for OVIC.
I understand.
But it would actually benefit our office to...
we could focus on the important stuff. That's
right. If we think about it, at the moment we deal with every single review and we treat it equally, and this would allow us to deal with the critical issues and have, I think, be more proactive. I'll be honest, at the moment the work is a bit more reactive than proactive, but it would shift it.
Let's talk about privacy and data protection. We have 10 data principles that...
information privacy principles.
Privacy principles that operate in Victoria. What's your office's role then in their application? What's the...
So we have a... and I should say with FOI, we also have an enforcement function if there's a breach of a standard we can be involved with enforcement, and we've made findings about non-adherence to that. And that's the same with privacy. We have an educative function where we provide guidance and make sure agencies are aware of their obligations and the public, but we also conciliate privacy complaints and then investigate serious interferences with privacy.
I want to talk about the current concerns about use and abuse of data. And we've all witnessed time and again particularly egregious data breaches, for example, constant threat of breaches. We had a whole slew of them that caused all sorts of grief, Medibank and Latitude and Eastern Health and various others.
I know quite well.
Which I'm sure you're extremely familiar with. And they have a range of consequences, from everything from identity theft through to just the pain and inconvenience of having to get a new driver's license or whatever, which was my experience. And it does seem like, well, we've, touch wood, not had any that I'm aware of too lately, but there were a bunch of them altogether, and they seem to be increasing. Is protection of data almost futile?
No, it's not futile, but I think that it seems that the mindset has shifted to it's not if it's going to happen, but when. And I don't think it's futile, but I think that under the current environment, you might think it's futile, in that I think we've dropped the ball slightly and been asleep at the wheel on these privacy issues. And I think there's more responsibility on the citizen than ever before to take care of their own privacy. So I think before it was potentially the organisation's responsibility, but now I think there's some buyer beware. You need to be aware of your own privacy rights and the company you're engaging with or the agency you're engaging with. That makes it difficult in a government context, but I will say that the Victorian government itself, the main agencies, haven't really been subject to some significant breaches. What it's been is the contracted service providers that have been subject to the breaches. Vulnerable. So they're more vulnerable. So it's chipping away at the weakest link, which is unfortunately what bad actors do. So futile, I think, promotes no hope.
Yes,
and there is serious concern unless there's a change in behaviour by custodians of data and changes in the law that it would be futile. It would become futile.
Do you think we need to rebalance it? That the weight of responsibility should not rest entirely with the citizen?
I agree. It should. The onus should be on the agency or the organisation that's holding the information, but I think it's just good practice at the moment that you need to be aware of your own privacy rights. OVIC definitely has a role in educating people, but again, we get into this issue where if you don't have a choice in providing the information, what can you do about it?
What do you do with your own personal data? I'm very careful with my own information. I don't have much of a digital presence. Also, we noticed that.
Well, that's because I don't have much to say. And also, I think just seeing how things develop, there's lots of lessons for us that opinions now may not be, they may be made in good faith now, but without the context and the digital environment, you just better to remain quiet, not have much of a digital presence. That's my view. But I'm not a boomer, by the way. Not that there's anything wrong with boomers, but that makes me sound like I don't, I'm not involved with technology. Yeah. I think if you think about it, I've heard this described before by regulators, privacy really is the right to control. Share what you want in one area and not provide that information in another area. So it's not, the advice isn't don't engage with any platforms. It's just be careful that you should always go in with the knowledge that potentially this could be disclosed.
it used to be called the Herald Sun test.
The pub test or
yes,
whatever it is now.
exactly.
I'm not down with the lingo.
So one of the factors that compounds data privacy is when agencies, departments, whoever, accumulate outrageous amounts of data that they do not dispose of.
Yes.
And we saw this particularly with the Optus case, where people who'd long since moved to other providers still had their data sitting on the servers or whatever for Optus, and that caused exponentially more grief than it otherwise would have. So can we be confident, Sean Morrison, that state government departments are disposing of, in a safe and effective way, data that they no longer need?
I can feel a byline coming on here for a front page. If I was honest, no. You can't be confident, and that comes back to having some awareness of what you're providing. That's a binary response. Probably the legal answer is it depends.
Yep.
As
usual.
As usual. And we would go into what data, where and how, and it might be fantastic for critical high-risk data and then looser on the edges for data that probably doesn't have that same high value.
Because probably, 5 or so years ago, there was a great flurry of activity around data hygiene.
Yes.
That we should collect no more than we absolutely need as an organisation, and that we should dispose of it when it's no longer required. And it seems that that sort of focus has been lost of recent times, maybe because we've had so many instances of distress. But is that what we need back?
Yeah, I think we need adherence just to the basic principles of record management, and that is it's a step before privacy. And we've worked with the Public Records Office of Victoria, and records management is not cool. It's not in vogue.
No, but it's critical.
It's critical. It underpins actually information security, privacy, and freedom of information. And we see over collection. There's usually no ill intent. But we've got it, and it's just forgotten about.
Yes.
And then there's a retention and disposal authority, and that's not adhered to. And all of those things are costly and timely. In a service-constrained environment, you may direct resources to other priorities. And we've seen some of the breaches that have involved government information by contract services providers is they've held information longer than they should or over-collected.
Massively. I want to talk too about the flip side, because I think the experience in many quarters is that being able to share information, for example, across government departments, would be very positive for a lot of people. We sort of saw this with My Health,
yes,
which never really sort of reached its potential, I don't think. But there is, I think, value in not having to tell your story 75 times to different people in separate agencies. Is that allowed? What sort of level of information sharing is permissible?
Well, the level of information sharing that's permissible is what you advise the individual when you're collecting it. So if your collection statement and privacy policy is well written and the citizen is well informed, sharing is allowed and does happen all the time, because we understand people with multiple touch points into government don't want to be frustrated by providing the same information again. But it's critical to know that you can't assume the citizen has said, yes, you can share that information. So it really comes down to what you tell someone, how you're collecting, using and disclosing the information. And OVIC has issued guidance on what a good information sharing culture is, because we see the value of information sharing. It's more productive, it's usually better for an individual, it's better value for money, it usually gets better outcomes when you can look at multiple data points, especially in the service provision space and intervention. But again, it comes down to what are you telling people?
And sometimes they tell us way too much. So I'm thinking particularly of the commercial environment where, you know, in order to buy a sort of $15 item online, you have to accept terms and conditions which seem to run for pages and pages and pages. And the most recent and particularly appalling example of Disney rejecting a claim for wrongful death on the grounds that somebody signed up for a 1-month trial of Disney Plus.
That's right.
I mean, the mismatch there is just mind-blowing. But what about the sort of absurd amounts of careful legal drafting that people pay absolutely no attention to, and what impact that therefore can have on their rights further down the line? Is that an area that you're looking into at all?
Definitely. The information privacy principles say collection of information must be fair and reasonable, and how can there be consent where there's confusion? And to be fair and reasonable, the terms must be clear. Now, I'm sure there could be a fantastical legal argument made about how that's fair and reasonable and it's protecting of the organisation, but we would not look fondly on such a collection statement that tried to carve out people's rights. I mean, it goes to the fairness to start with, and then what's reasonable is if you're requiring someone to engage in a service and it's got a click-wrap 10-page privacy consent, I would argue that doesn't meet the foundational premise of IPP1.
Yes. Okay, that's good to know.
I don't think we see that in a government context.
No, not so much.
But that doesn't mean it's not happening, because we only see what's brought to us usually. So we do have an audit function and we do audits.
Is there a case for reform there as well?
I think the the Privacy and Data Protection Act is quite a good act because it's principles based, so it's survived. It's well written, definitely needs reform, and when the Australian reforms occur, we will be further out of step with what I think is really good privacy policy. So there is a case for reform in Victoria, but it's about reform and also adherence to the principles. So if we had fantastic adherence to the principles, or would I say, it's not proper practice, but just they're more in the mind of people in their everyday, day-to-day jobs, we'd probably have a better privacy framework at the moment. Reform would be great, but what's the point of reform if we can't get compliance with the current legislation?
So when you say when there's the national principles are in place, we'll be further out of step. What do you mean?
Well, we don't have a notifiable data breach scheme in Victoria, for example. We have something, a quasi scheme like that, but the APPs are up for reform.
Which are the Australian privacy principles?
The Australian privacy principles. And of course, public sector agencies aren't subject to them, but you want some uniformity between privacy frameworks, so as an individual, you understand your rights across a system. So if you lived on the border of Victoria and, say, New South Wales, and you received a health service over the border, you're dealing with a different privacy regulator and a different set of reforms. So we want some consistency, consistency of practice and basic understanding.
So all of this indicates that the information space, which is where you live and reside, is an incredibly fast-moving target.
Definitely.
There is so much technological development and commercial exploitation and potential positive applications and evil, nasty ones as well. So this puts you and your office at the centre of significant current and future debates, it seems to me. So if you were to think about the opportunities and challenges of your tenure in this role, Sean, what do you see as being the key dimensions of that for your role?
So I think the opportunity is that it's a great time to be involved with FOI and privacy, and you probably never hear that again, in that now is really I think it's the demarcation line between the old and the new, especially in freedom of information. And with privacy, we're seeing the law be tested like never before. But that creates an opportunity, one, to give us a voice for regulatory reform, two, to step in more to educate individuals. So that will be, it's one of the things that I'd like to achieve, that we've done a lot of guidance for agencies, but now trying to engage, even though we do have guidance for individuals, further simplifying that of how they can protect themselves and how they can engage with agencies. And the challenges are that we're probably, I think we're maybe, if we wanted to meet the challenges that are coming, we would have started 2 years ago. So it's an arms race, I think, about
constantly.
privacy, and that's through no fault of anyone's. It's just that, you know, AI's emerged from nowhere, and there'd be people watching this saying, AI, I knew about it 10 years ago, but as in into the common, you know, into the zeitgeist, AI is, you know, your toaster's going to have AI. It's, if you don't have AI, you're seen as probably a Luddite. You know, you must have AI. So I think what's happening is we're probably 2 years behind to meet the challenges of this. So that's no comment on the office. That's just talking about the environment and the landscape and government. You know, we're only seeing national frameworks now about AI, for example, and we're seeing parliamentary inquiries into assisted decision making and all of these things that maybe if we didn't have a global pandemic, we could have turned our mind to 2 or 3 years ago.
So if you go back a couple of years, which is the metric you're using, that's probably around the emergence of ChatGPT.
Yes.
So that, of course, I think pulled it into parlance, as you say. So that was a tipping point. Are there other dimensions of AI that concern you or that will be important in this role?
Yes. So I think AI is, it's a positive and a negative depending on the environment. So AI in healthcare, for example, if we're going to have healthcare in the home, it might be fantastic. We've seen it potentially invent some new antibiotics or find some new antibiotics, and it can scan over X-rays and CT scans and look for heart disease in ways we've never known before. So it's more a complementary service. But if you think about all of the privacy harms that are happening now, or should I say significant interferences with privacy, imagine that weaponised by AI. So if you had someone who was stealing data, but AI made it mimic an employee interacting with your data, so you didn't even know for 10 years' time, or if AI could be weaponised in a way of disclosing information, or it could be used to over-collect and then create opinions about people which aren't true, and then the agency relies on that information. So the way I'd like to think about it is the humble USB stick. That can be a great threat for an organisation. It's handy to be able to put documents on it and things like that, but for the way for a virus to get into your system is through USB. So some agencies, they don't take the risk. They lock down their USB ports, and it's inconvenient, whatever, but you know, it's a risk assessment. Some let that happen because the value of the information is
greater.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So AI needs a risk assessment before you introduce it, and you need to understand the benefits and the cons. Okay.
So are you going to provide guidance on that?
We've provided general guidance on AI. We have guidance on ChatGPT. We have guidance on Microsoft Copilot, but we've also opened up, we sought consultation on what AI guidance people are needing, and that'll be out in the new year. But the thing is that we provide guidance on that. People still need to absorb it, implement it, and by the time that's out, you know, it's the arms race element. So it comes back to the risk assessment and understanding the first principles of privacy.
Which I think, in my mind anyway, goes back to the whole construct around principles. That's the only way, it would seem to me, to stay at least in the game, is to be principles-based. If you're trying to legislate or regulate for any particular environment, you're going to be out of time and out of date very fast. Is that your view?
I agree, and that's why the Privacy and Data Protection Act has survived quite well, because it's about principles and it's about fair and reasonable, and it talks about other things like the standard changes for the context with principles. If you try and legislate just for AI, that could be redundant in 2 years' time. I do note New South Wales had their inquiry, and they've done things like recommended agencies have a chief AI officer. They're great from a positional and organisational perspective, but it won't help with the law. The law needs to be flexible to account for. I think you should approach it with, if you're writing a constitution, how would that survive in 100 years' time? And so you really need to apply with the principles to account for new technologies.
One other thing I just wanted to pick up with you, because it's an issue that's talked about a lot or mentioned a lot, but not, I think, broadly understood. How are you responding to calls for data sovereignty? So this is in the context of First Nations data, which I think is, a really interesting and important dimension of self-determination. But how are you engaging with that?
Previously, we did a research piece. It was only a small sample around First Nations people and their concerns around privacy and data sovereignty. And we issued some guidance for organisations to understand these were things about some of the concerns were providing information of others, it wasn't culturally appropriate, or what happens to that information when it's provided. There's a need to know how it's going to be interpreted. So we've issued guidance on that, and I think we can do more in that area. I note the Uruk Justice Commission, we heard issues around calls for there being, where there's First Nations people data, that First Nations people should be involved in the interpretation of that and the custodianship of that. So I think it's important. It's something for us to keep a watching brief on, but I think it expands more to individual data sovereignty. If someone has health information, should they have access to that, similar to my health record? But should a citizen have access to all of the information that you've collected and used about them? Now, it's difficult in a law enforcement context or a terrorist context, but in general, individual data sovereignty, I think, is a good principle.
So does that go back to your proactive mandatory release type principle around a proactive approach?
I think with mandatory release, we would say that's more to do with government policy. So things around budgets and why decisions were made, and there should be a separate pathway for people to get access, even easier than that, to their own information.
Yes, so a sort of parallel macro-micro track.
Yes. So health information, for example, should be easy for an individual to get. Interactions with the justice system, it should be easy for people to get.
It seems to me this job is all about the marathon, not the sprint.
Yes, I'm a plotter, put it that way. I'm a long plotter. And when my opening day at OVIC, it probably wasn't the most inspirational speech ever, but I said that trouble seems to follow me. So, in a good way.
That's encouraging for
yes, more in that challenges come to be overcome, and the work is valuable and of merit. But yes, it probably didn't go down too well, and I think that it's a great time. Everyone's bound to say that they feel lucky to have their role and all the platitudes that go with it. But I love this job, and I really think OVIC. It's not my office, it is OVIC, can make a difference. The proof will be in 4 years' time, if people are watching this back. Success or failure will be apparent for everyone to see. I keep saying, if there's no legislative reform, significant legislative reform, I'll feel that I've failed in my role. And I'm happy to put that on the record.
Okay, you've got your personal KPIs?
Yes, and I know I don't have any control over that, but it's how we advocate and push the dial in that area.
Well, it seems to me you have extraordinary resilience and enormous skills to bring to this role, which I think, for better or worse, people need to know more about. So we appreciate enormously your time this afternoon to talk about the Office of the Victorian Information Commissioner, and best of luck between here and the end of your term. We look forward to legislative reform.
I appreciate it.
It's been a great pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks, Lynn.